In the beginning, there was the mask. Not the crude disguise of carnival or masquerade, but something far more exquisite, far more insidious of face, crafted with the precision of a master artisan, polished until it gleamed with the very light that others wished to see reflected back at them. This is where we must start, dear traveler of the inner realms, in this palace of mirrors where the persona reigns supreme, draped in robes of acceptability, crowned with the approval of a world that knows nothing of the prisoner within. You have worn this mask so long that you have forgotten the weight of it pressing against your skin. It has become as natural as breathing, this careful choreography of presentation, this endless performance where every gesture is measured, every word weighed against the golden scales of social currency. The persona Jung's term for this elaborate costume of the ego is not born of malice or deception, but of the deepest human longing to belong, to be seen as worthy, to find our place in the great theater of collective life. But what artistry went into its creation, layer upon layer, built through countless interactions, each social encounter adding another brushstroke to this masterpiece of adaptation. Here, the smile that learned to appear at precisely the right moment. There, the laugh that rings with just the proper note of enthusiasm. The voice that knows when to soften, when to strengthen, when to disappear entirely into the comfortable anonymity of agreement. Watch how the shoulders learn to carry themselves, how the hands discover their appropriate gestures, how even the eyes develop that particular way of meeting or avoiding the gaze of others. This is the gilded prison that Jung recognized as both blessing and curse, a necessary structure that allows us to function in the world, yet one that can become so elaborate, so all-consuming, that we forget there was ever anything beneath it. The ego, that organizing principle of consciousness, becomes the architect of its own confinement, building walls of gold so beautiful that even the prisoner admires them, forgetting that gold, however precious, can still create bars. Consider the child who learns that tears bring discomfort to the adults around them, and so develops a brave face that earns approval instead. Watch as this face hardens over years into an impenetrable mask of cheerfulness, until the capacity for authentic sorrow becomes buried so deep that even the wearer cannot find it. Or observe the young one whose natural exuberance is met with calls for quieter behavior, and see how the vibrant flame of their expression slowly dims to the socially acceptable flicker that disturbs no one, threatens no one, but also illuminates nothing. The tragedy is not that we develop these adaptive mechanisms. They are, in many ways, essential for survival in the complex web of human relationship. The tragedy lies in what Jung called the unconscious identification with the persona, the moment when we forget that the mask is not the face, that the costume is not the body, that the performance is not the performer. We become so skilled at being what others need us to be that we lose contact with what we actually are. In the depths of the unconscious, however, something stirs. Like a bird that has known only the confines of its cage, the authentic self presses against the golden bars of persona, sensing something vast and uncharted beyond the familiar boundaries. This stirring is not comfortable. It carries with it a strange longing, an unnamed restlessness that cannot be satisfied by the usual rewards of successful performance. It whispers of worlds beyond the theater, of expressions that have never been given voice, of aspects of being that have been exiled to the shadowlands, of the unacceptable. The soul, the deeper organizing principle that Jung distinguished from both ego and persona, knows its own nature. It carries within it the full spectrum of human possibility, not just the narrow band of frequencies that society has deemed acceptable. It remembers wildness where the persona has learned domestication. It holds space for darkness where the persona insists on light. It knows the raw truth of feeling where the persona offers only the refined presentation of emotion, deemed appropriate for public consumption. This is why the golden prison begins to feel confining, even when it continues to earn the applause of the world. The soul recognizes its exile and begins to send signal streams that speak in languages the persona cannot translate. Moments of inexplicable sadness that arise in the midst of apparent success, sudden surges of anger or longing that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. These are not symptoms of dysfunction, but rather the first stirrings of what Jung called the individuation process, the soul's deep movement toward wholeness. The persona, however, interprets these stirrings as threats to its carefully constructed order. It responds with increased vigilance, more elaborate defenses, tighter control over the presentation of self. The smile becomes more fixed, the performance more perfect, the adaptation more complete. And yet, the more energy poured into maintaining the golden mask, the more the soul pushes back. Like water finding its way through even the smallest cracks in a dammed dot. This is the fundamental tension that marks the beginning of conscious psychological development. The recognition that something within us is larger than our carefully curated self-presentation, something that demands expression beyond the narrow confines of social acceptability. It is the moment when we begin to sense that we are both the performer and the audience, the prison guard and the prisoner, the architect of our own confinement and the one who holds the key to freedom. The gilded prison reveals itself not as external oppression but as an internal construction, beautiful, valuable, and ultimately voluntary. This recognition carries both terror and possibility. Terror, because it suggests that we have been complicit in our own confinement. Possibility, because it hints that what has been constructed can also be deconstructed, that what has been learned can be unlearned, that what has been chosen can be chosen again. In the space between these realizations, the journey begins not as dramatic revolution, but as quiet recognition, not as violent overthrow, but as gentle awakening to the truth that, beneath the golden mask, something real has been waiting all along, patient as stone, persistent as water, ready to emerge when the soul finally finds the courage to remember its own face. There comes a moment quiet as the first drop of rain before the storm, subtle as the shift of light at duskwen. Something ancient within you stirs and whispers, "This is not who you are." It arrives without fanfare, this crack in the perfect mirror of your constructed self, appearing like a hairline fracture in glass that has been struck by an invisible hand. You may not notice it at first, this delicate fissure in the smooth surface of your persona, but it is there nonetheless, spreading slowly through the crystalline facade you have spent a lifetime polishing to perfection. The mirror this sacred mirror of consciousness has reflected back to you for so long the image you believed the world required. In its gleaming surface, you have seen the successful professional, the devoted parent, the charming companion, the reliable friend. Each role carefully crafted, each gesture rehearsed until it became second nature. Each smile calculated to produce the desired response. You have gazed into this mirror each morning and evening, adjusting your mask, straightening your costume, preparing for another day's performance on the grand stage of social existence. But mirrors, even the most perfectly crafted ones, are fragile things. They cannot withstand forever the weight of pretense. the pressure of maintaining an image that grows ever more distant from the truth that pulses beneath your skin like hidden fire. And so it begins, this almost imperceptible shift in the deep waters of your being. Like the subtle movement of tectonic plates far beneath the ocean floor that signals the approach of something vast and transformative. Perhaps it comes to you in a moment of unexpected exhaustion, when the elaborate choreography of your daily performance suddenly feels too heavy to sustain. You find yourself standing before your bathroom mirror in the early morning light, and for just an instant briefer than a heartbeat, swifter than thought, you see someone else looking back at you, a stranger with your eyes, wearing your face, but carrying within their gaze a depth of longing and confusion that your carefully maintained persona would never acknowledge. The sight of this unknown self startles you, and you quickly reassemble your familiar expression, smooth away the lines of weariness, practice your morning smile. But the image lingers, haunting the edges of your consciousness like a half-remembered dream. Or perhaps the crack appears during one of those moments when your mask slips without warning, when the performance falters and something raw and unscripted emerges from the shadows of your being. You are in a meeting, playing your professional role with practiced ease, when suddenly a wave of inexplicable sadness washes over you. Your voice catches on a simple word, your eyes fill with tears that have no apparent source, and for a terrifying instant, your colleagues glimpse the vulnerable creature that lives beneath your competent exterior. You recover quickly, make excuses about allergies or fatigue, but the damage is done. The crack has appeared, and through it seeps something that cannot be contained or controlled. This is what Jung understood so profoundly, that the human psyche, like nature itself, operates according to laws of balance and compensation. He called it enantiodromia, this ancient Ek principle that describes how all things eventually turn into their opposite when carried to extremes. The bright day yields to dark night. The flowing river carves its banks until it changes course, and the carefully constructed persona, maintained too rigidly for too long, begins to crack under the pressure of its own perfection. You have poured so much energy into being the person you thought you should be that you have forgotten the person you actually are. You have invested so completely in the image that the mirror reflects back to you that you have lost touch with the one who stands before it, looking out through eyes that have grown weary of seeing only what they are supposed to see. The persona, this beautiful, terrible mask that has served you so well in navigating the complexities of social existence, has become a prison of gold. Lovely to behold, but suffocating to the soul that dwells within. And so the unconscious, in its infinite wisdom, begins to stir, like a great whale rising from the depths of an ocean you had forgotten existed. Something vast and primordial moves within you. It is your shadow, not evil, not malevolent, but simply everything you have denied, rejected, and pushed away in your relentless pursuit of an acceptable self. All the emotions you were taught were inappropriate, all the desires you learned to suppress, all the aspects of your nature that didn't fit the neat categories of your chosen identity, they have been gathering in the darkness, growing stronger, waiting for their moment to emerge. The crack in the mirror is their invitation, their opportunity to finally be seen. Through that hairline fracture seeps the energy of everything you have refused to acknowledge, the anger you have swallowed, the grief you have postponed, the wild joy you have deemed too messy for public consumption. These disowned aspects of your being don't seek to destroy you, they seek to complete you, to restore the wholeness that was fragmented when you chose to be only part of who you truly are. This is the beginning of what the mystics have always known and Jung articulated with such precision that every journey toward authentic selfhood must pass through the valley of dissolution. The full self must crack, must show its limitations, must reveal its inadequacy to contain the fullness of your being. The persona must be recognized not as your true identity, but as a tool useful when consciously employed, dangerous when unconsciously identified with. In the quiet moments now, when you are alone with your thoughts, you feel it stirring, this unnamed restlessness, this sense that something is shifting beneath the surface of your carefully ordered existence. The mirror no longer reflects back the simple, clear image it once did. Instead, you catch glimpses of complexity, contradiction, depth. You see the successful professional, yes, but also the child who dreams impossible dreams. You see the reliable friend, but also the rebel who questions everything. You see the composed adult, but also the wild creature who longs to dance naked in thunderstorms. These glimpses frighten you at first, for they threaten the coherent narrative you have constructed about who you are and what your life means. But they also excite you with their hint of something more vast and alive than the narrow confines of your established identity. They whisper of possibilities you had forgotten, of aspects of yourself that have been waiting patiently in the wings for their chance to step into the light. The crack in the mirror is not a catastrophe, is an invitation. It is your psyche's way of saying that you have grown too large for the container you have built around yourself, that the time has come to explore territories of your being that have remained unmapped and unexplored. It is the beginning of the great work that Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who you think you should be. So, let the cracks spread. Let the perfect reflection splinter and fragment. Let the light of your authentic self begin to stream through the fissures in your carefully maintained facade. For it is only when the false mirror breaks that you can begin to see with your true eyes, to recognize the magnificent complexity of your actual being, to embrace the beautiful, terrible, wonderful mystery that you are. There comes a moment in every human life when the orchestra of our social selves falls silent, not the gentle quiet of evening's descent, but a sudden, jarring cessation as if the conductor has abandoned the podium mid-symphony, leaving only the echo of what was reverberating in the hollow chambers of our being. This is the uncomfortable silence, the void between who we pretend to be and who we actually are. It arrives uninvited, often in the spaces between our carefully orchestrated performances, in the pause after hanging up the phone, in the mirror's reflection when no one else is watching, in the hollow moments when applause fades and we are left alone with the sound of our own breathing. The ego, that masterful performer who has spent decades perfecting its repertoire of acceptable selves, suddenly finds itself without an audience, without the familiar scripts of productivity, relationship, achievement, or even struggle to define its worth. It stands naked in the theater of consciousness, trembling like an actor who has forgotten every line they ever memorized. This silence is not the loneliness of being unloved, that familiar ache we know how to navigate, how to fill with distractions or remedy with connection. No, this is the profound aloneness of meeting ourselves without costume or script, without the reassuring weight of our personas to tell us who we are supposed to be. It is the terror of discovering that beneath all our doing, beneath all our becoming, there exists a being so fundamental, so unadorned, that the mind recoils from its simplicity. In the mythology of the soul's journey, this silence represents the threshold between the upper world of social consciousness and the underworld of authentic selfhood. Like Persephone standing at the entrance to Hades' realm, We hesitate before this descent, knowing instinctively that to enter is to be forever changed. The familiar landmarks of our identity, our roles, our relationships, our achievements, our failures, all fade into irrelevance in this strange, wordless territory. The ego protests, of course. It conjures urgent tasks, important calls to make, people who need us, problems that require immediate attention. It floods the silence with anxiety, with restlessness, with the compelling illusion that somewhere else, in some other moment, lies the answer to our unnamed longing. But these are merely the death throes of a dying performance, the final gestures of a self that has served its purpose and now must yield to something deeper. Jung understood this silence as the necessary prelude to individuation, that mysterious process by which the soul separates from its collective identifications and begins to discover its own unique voice. But before that voice can emerge, there must be this pause, this pregnant emptiness in which all our learned responses fall away like autumn leaves, revealing the bare branches of our essential nature. In this void, we encounter what the mystics have long recognized as the dark night of the soul, not a depression or a pathology, but a sacred emptiness, a fertile darkness in which new life gestates. It is uncomfortable precisely because it strips away all the comfortable illusions we have constructed about who we are and why we matter. Without our familiar personas to mediate our relationship with existence, we are forced to confront the raw fact of our being. The silence asks us, who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when there is nothing to achieve, nothing to prove, nothing to become? Who are you in the absence of all the stories you tell about yourself? The questions hang in the air like incense, permeating every corner of consciousness with their unsettling presence. For some, this encounter with authentic solitude becomes unbearable. They flee back into the noise, into the comfortable chaos of a life lived on the surface, where the silence can be drowned out by the familiar symphonies of social engagement. They surround themselves with people, with activities, with purposes, anything to avoid this confrontation with their own unmediated existence. But for those who can bear to sit with the discomfort, who can resist the ego's desperate attempts to fill the void with familiar patterns, something extraordinary begins to unfold. In the depths of this silence, beneath the layers of learned identity and social conditioning, something stirs, not the ego's frantic chatter, but a deeper voice, ancient and patient, that has been waiting all along for this moment of quiet recognition. This is the voice of the self, Jung's term for that mysterious center of wholeness that exists beyond the ego's fragmentary identifications. It speaks not in words but in symbols, not in concepts but in feelings, not in explanations but in presence. It is the voice that knows without knowing, that understands without understanding, that simply is without needing to justify its existence. The uncomfortable silence, then, is not an emptiness to be filled, but a fullness to be experienced. It is the pregnant pause between the old self's death and the new self's birth, the sacred interval in which transformation becomes possible. To rush through it, to fill it with distraction or explanation, is to abort the very process of becoming whole in this threshold space. We begin to understand that our worth is not contingent upon our performance, our value not dependent upon our productivity. We are not the roles we play, the masks we wear, the stories we tell about ourselves. We are something far more fundamental, far more mysterious. We are consciousness. It's experiencing itself through the temporary vehicle of this particular human life. The silence teaches us that being is enough. not being something specific, not being successful or loved or important, but simply being existing as a unique expression of the universal life force, no more or less valuable than any other manifestation of existence. This recognition is both terrifying and liberating, for it strips away all our carefully constructed reasons for mattering while revealing the deeper truth that we matter simply because we are, as we learn to inhabit this uncomfortable silence. To make ourselves at home in the void between personas, we begin to discover a different kind of presence. Not the brittle presence of performance, always anxious about audience approval, but the grounded presence of authenticity, rooted in the bedrock of being itself. This is the presence that needs no external validation, that draws its strength, not from doing but from being, not from becoming but from simply existing as fully as possible in each moment. The silence, uncomfortable as it may be, becomes our teacher, our guide into the deeper chambers of the soul. It shows us that beneath all our social selves lies an unshakable foundation, a core of being that cannot be diminished by failure or inflated by success. Here, in this place of profound aloneness, we discover the paradox of authentic solitude, that in meeting ourselves completely, without pretense or performance, we touch something universal, something that connects us to all of existence in ways that our social personas never could. This is the gift of the uncomfortable, silence, not comfort, but truth, not the easy answers of social conformity, but the difficult questions that lead to authentic selfhood, not the reassurance of collective identity, but the profound responsibility of individual consciousness, awakening to its own unique nature. And so we sit with the silence, neither running from it nor rushing to fill it, but learning to inhabit it with the patience of a gardener who trusts in the invisible processes of growth. For in this seeming emptiness, something is already beginning to stir, something that will eventually emerge as our most authentic self, born not from the world's expectations, but from the mysterious depths of our own being in the furthest reaches of your inner landscape, where the light of conscious awareness has never dared to penetrate. Something stirs. It moves with the patience of geological time, yet carries the urgency of a heartbeat that has been held too long beneath the waters of denial. This is the shadow, the absence of light, but the presence of everything you have refused to call your own picture, if you will, an archaeological expedition into the buried cities of your soul. Each careful brushstroke of awareness reveals another fragment, another shard of the person you once were before the world taught you what was acceptable to be. Here lies your primal rage, fossilized beneath decades of politeness. There, your wild hunger, preserved in the amber of social conditioning. And deeper still, the raw, unfiltered truth of your desires, entombed beneath the marble monuments you erected to respectability. The shadow does not announce itself with fanfare or ceremony. It comes as a whisper in the pause between breaths, as the face that flickers in peripheral vision, as the dream that leaves you gasping in the dark hours before dawn. It is the stranger you glimpse in photographs, who wears your features but carries an expression you do not recognize, perhaps recognize too well, and therefore fear. For so long, you have been the curator of your own museum, carefully selecting which aspects of yourself deserve display while relegating the rest to the basement archives. You have polished your persona until it gleams like a mirror, reflecting back to the world only what it expects to see. But mirrors, as you may have noticed, have a peculiar property. They also cast shadows, and these shadows grow longer as the light grows brighter. The invitation arrives not as a formal summons, but as a disturbance in the carefully ordered landscape. of your conscious mind. Perhaps it manifests as an inexplicable irritation with someone who embodies qualities you claim to despise. Perhaps it emerges as a compulsion toward behaviors that contradict your carefully constructed self-image. Or maybe it appears as a magnetic pull toward exactly those situations and people your rational mind warns you to avoid. This is the shadow's ancient wisdom at work. It knows that what we resist with the greatest vigor often contains the very medicine our souls require for healing. The alcoholic who judges others drinking, the saint who obsesses over sin, the pacifist who dreams of violence, each is being called by their shadow to reclaim the disowned territories of their psyche. But here lies the profound misunderstanding that has plagued humanity since we first learned to create categories of good and evil. The shadow does not come as conqueror or destroyer, though it may initially appear as such to the frightened ego. It arrives as integrator, as the dark twin who has been waiting patiently for recognition, carrying in its arms all the gifts you threw away in your haste to become acceptable. Consider the mythology of every culture, and you will find this same archetypal pattern repeated endlessly: the descent into the underworld, the confrontation with the dark brother, the integration of the forbidden. Persephone must descend to Hades to understand the full cycle of her nature. Jacob must wrestle with the angel through the long night to earn his true name. Christ must face the temptations in the wilderness before he can embrace his divine mission. Your shadow carries the same mythic weight, the same transformative potential. It is not the enemy of your light, but its necessary complement, the dark soil from which your brightest flowers grow. Without the compost of your rejected aspects, your conscious personality remains sterile, beautiful perhaps, but incapable of the rich complexity that marks true individuation. The process begins with recognition, that moment when you glimpse yourself in the mirror of your strongest reactions to others. The person who triggers your most visceral disgust, your most righteous anger, your most uncomfortable attraction, they are serving as a screen upon which your shadow projects its hidden contents. What you see and judge so harshly in them is often the very quality that lives unacknowledged within your own psyche. This recognition requires a courage that goes beyond the heroic. It demands the willingness to be wrong about yourself, to discover that your self-image has been built upon a foundation of selective blindness. It asks you to entertain the possibility that your greatest virtues might be compensations for your greatest fears, and that your most cherished beliefs might be walls erected to keep certain truths at bay. The shadow's invitation is whispered. In the language of paradox, it suggests that your path to wholeness leads not away from your darkness, but through it. Not around your wounds, but into their mysterious center. It proposes that the very qualities you have spent lifetimes suppressing might contain the keys to your liberation. That your demons might be angels in disguise, waiting for the alchemy of acceptance to reveal their true nature. As you stand at this threshold, feeling the shadow's dark hand extended in offering, remember that every great transformation in human history has required this same courage: the willingness to embrace what was previously rejected, to integrate what was formerly cast out. The shadow does not ask you to become something you are not, but to become everything you truly are, including those aspects that make you uncomfortable with your own complexity. This is the deepest teaching of the shadow's invitation. That wholeness is not achieved through perfection, but through integration, not by transcending your humanity, but by embracing it in all its magnificent contradictions. The shadow comes not to destroy your light, but to teach it how to dance with darkness, creating the rich chiaroscuro that marks every authentic human life. when the cacophony of the world grows too loud, when the mirrors of society reflect back only distorted fragments of who we have pretended to be, the soul calls us to a different path of ancient way of the hermit. The seeker who turns away from the marketplace of masks to journey into the vast wilderness of the inner landscape. This is not the withdrawal of the defeated, nor the retreat of the bitter, but the sacred pilgrimage of one who has heard the whisper of their authentic name being called from the depths of silence. The archetypal hermit that Jung recognized in the collective unconscious carries a lantern through the darkness, not the harsh fluorescent light of external judgment, but the gentle, steady flame of inner knowing. This figure, ancient as humanity itself, appears in our dreams and myths as the wise one who has learned to see by a different illumination, who has discovered that the most profound truths cannot be found in the glare of public scrutiny, but only in the soft shadows of solitary contemplation. To embark upon the hermit's path is to step away from the external mirrors that have for so long defined the boundaries of acceptable selfhood. Those mirrors the opinions of others, the standards of society, the relentless feedback loop of approval and disapproval have served as our primary means of self-recognition. We have learned to see ourselves only as others see us, to know ourselves only through the reflection of their reactions. But what happens when we turn away from these mirrors and dare to look within? At first, there is only darkness, the disorienting void that appears when we cease to define ourselves through external validation. The ego, so accustomed to navigating why the landmarks of others' expectations, finds itself lost in terrain that has no familiar signposts. This is the beginning of what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, that necessary passage through unknowing that precedes true self-discovery. But solitude, initially experienced as punishment or abandonment, gradually reveals itself as sanctuary. In the absence of an audience, the performance can finally end. The exhausting choreography of social acceptability gives way to the natural rhythms of authentic being. Here, in the silence, we begin to hear voices that have been drowned out by the noise of collective life. The voice of intuition, the voice of the body's wisdom, the voice of the soul speaking in its native tongue. The hermit's lantern is not a torch that illuminates vast distances, but a gentle flame that reveals only the next step on the path. This is the nature of inner guidance, does not provide the grand map of transformation, but offers just enough light to move forward with trust. In learning to navigate by this inner illumination, we discover capacities that the persona never developed. We learn to read the subtle language of feelings, to interpret the symbolic communications of dreams, to recognize the patterns of our own authentic energy. Withdrawal from the world allows us to distinguish between solitude and loneliness, two experiences that the socially conditioned mind often confuses. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection from others, the sense of being cut off from the warmth of human relationship. But solitude, true solitude, is the profound connection with the self that makes all other connections possible. It is in this sacred aloneness that we discover we are never truly alone, for we carry within us the entire cosmos of human experience. The hermit's path teaches us that authentic relationship begins with the relationship to ourselves. Only when we can be present with our own depths, with our fears, our longings, our contradictions, our untapped possibilities, can we offer genuine presence to another. The persona's relationships are always performances, elaborate dances of mutual accommodation that touch only the surface of human possibility. But the hermit learns to commune with the totality of their being, preparing for relationships that can hold the fullness of what it means to be human, in the silence of withdrawal, we begin to hear the authentic rhythms of our own nature. Some discover they are naturally contemplative, while others find their essence in dynamic creativity. Some learn they need long periods of quiet reflection, while others realize their authentic self emerges through movement and engagement. The hermit's path is not about becoming a recluse, but about learning to honor the natural rhythms of our individual being, freed from the imposed schedules of social expectation. This inner pilgrimage reveals that what we have called depression, or anxiety, or restlessness may sometimes be the soul's protest against the constraints of inauthentic living. When we create space for these feelings to speak their truth without the interference of social judgment, they often reveal themselves as messengers carrying important information about what needs to change in our lives. The hermit learns to listen to these inner voices as oracles, sources of wisdom that the noisy world has taught us to ignore or medicate into silence. The lantern of inner guidance operates by a different logic than the harsh light of external judgment. Where the world demands immediate answers and decisive action, the inner light reveals that truth unfolds in its own time, that wisdom ripens in seasons that cannot be rushed. The hermit learns patience, not the passive waiting of the powerless, but the active receptivity of one who trusts the intelligence of the unfolding process. In this sanctuary of solitude, we begin to understand that the authentic self is not something we need to create or construct, but something we need to uncover and allow. Like an archaeologist carefully brushing away layers of accumulated debris to reveal the ancient artifact beneath, the hermit's work is one of excavation, removing the layers of conditioning, expectation, and adaptation that have buried the original self. The path of withdrawal reveals the sanctuary is not a place but a quality of being, the capacity to create sacred space wherever we are, to access the stillness that exists at the center of even the most chaotic circumstances. The hermit carries this portable sanctuary within, this ability to retreat into the inner temple where the authentic self dwells in perfect security. As we learn to navigate by inner light, we discover that this illumination is not separate from us, but emanates from the deepest core of our being. We are simultaneously the seeker and the sought, the hermit and the guiding light, the pilgrim and the sacred destination. This recognition marks a crucial turning point in the journey, moment when we realize that what we have been seeking in the external world has been waiting within us all along. Patient as eternity, bright as the first star appearing in the darkening sky of solitude. You have entered the chrysalis now, that sacred chamber of dissolution where all certainties melt away like morning frost in the heat of an unforgiving sun. Here, in this liminal space between what you were and what you might become, you float suspended in the dark honey of pure potential. Your former structures of self-liquefying into the primordial soup of transformation. This is the place the ancient alchemists knew so well, the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary darkness that precedes all genuine rebirth. The caterpillar, in its infinite wisdom, does not resist this dissolution. When the time comes, it spins its cocoon not as a shelter but as a tomb, surrendering completely to the mysterious intelligence that demands nothing less than total annihilation of its former form. Within the chrysalis, the caterpillar's body breaks down at the cellular level, becoming what scientists call soup, an undifferentiated, massive potential that bears no resemblance to what it once was or what it will become. This is not merely change, this is death and resurrection, enacted in the most literal sense, a complete dismantling of one form of existence to make way for something entirely other. And so it is with you now. wandering in this bewildering landscape of your own unmaking. The familiar landmarks of your identity have dissolved, leaving you to navigate by stars you cannot yet see, in a sky that seems to shift and change with each breath you take. The roles that once defined you, lover, parent, professional, friend, feel like costumes that no longer fit, hanging loose and strange on a body that seems to be reshaping itself from the inside out. You reach for the comfortable certainties that once anchored your sense of self, only to find them crumbling at your touch like ancient parchment exposed to air. This is the confusion that Jung understood was not pathology but necessitative, sacred bewilderment that signals the psyche's readiness to transcend its previous limitations. You have outgrown the container of your former self, and now you must endure the terrible freedom of existing without form, without definition, without the comforting boundaries that once told you where you ended and the world began. It is like being dissolved in the cosmic solvent of transformation, your solid sense of self becoming liquid, gaseous, ethereal. In the morning, you wake not knowing who will look back at you from the mirror. The face is familiar, but the eyes seem to belong to a stranger, sometimes bright with unexpected joy, sometimes dark with unfathomable sorrow, sometimes simply empty, waiting to be filled with whatever meaning might emerge from the depths of your being. You feel like an actor who has forgotten all their lines, standing on a stage where the script changes moment by moment and the audience expects a performance you no longer know how to give. Your relationships, too, exist in this strange suspension. Friends and family members look at you with puzzlement, sensing something different but unable to name what has changed. You find yourself unable to engage in the familiar patterns of interaction, the comfortable rhythms of connection that once felt as natural as breathing. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel forced and artificial, as if you are speaking a language you are forgetting even as the words leave your mouth. You are becoming incomprehensible to those who knew the person you used to be, and increasingly incomprehensible to yourself. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics have written about for centuries. The desert passage that the biblical prophets knew must be traversed before any authentic revelation could occur. But it is also something more immediate and embodied, the actual physical experience of a nervous system reorganizing itself, of neural pathways dissolving and reforming, of the very structures of consciousness undergoing fundamental alteration. You feel it in your body as much as in your mind, a restlessness that cannot be soothed, an energy that has nowhere to go, a sense of being pregnant with something you cannot yet name or understand. The chrysalis offers no comfort, no reassurance, no promise that what emerges will be better than what went before. It demands only faith in the invisible intelligence that guides this process of metamorphosis. Faith in the ancient wisdom that knows how to transform one form of life into another, without losing the essential spark that makes existence sacred. This is not the faith of religious doctrine, but the faith of the seed that trusts the darkness of the soil, the faith of the moon that surrenders to its phases of waxing and waning. Within this formless state, you begin to sense something, stirring not the return of your old self, but the first faint movements of something unprecedented, like the imaginal discs within the caterpillar's dissolving body that will eventually become the wings of the butterfly. New possibilities begin to coalesce in the depths of your confusion. They are barely perceptible at first, these seeds of your future selfhood, but they carry within them the blueprint of your authentic nature, the pattern of who you were always meant to become. You learn to trust the darkness now, to see it not as the absence of light, but as the womb of all illumination. In the confusion, you discover a strange kind of clarity, not the clarity of knowing what will happen next, but the clarity of being present to whatever is happening now. Without the armor of your old certainties, you become permeable to experiences that would have been filtered out by your previous way of being. You feel everything more deeply, the texture of air against your skin, the subtle rhythms of your own breathing, the vast interconnectedness that links you to every living thing. This is the gift hidden within the chrysalis, the discovery that you are not separate from the transformational force that moves through all of nature. You are not something undergoing transformation. You are transformation itself, temporarily gathered into the form of a human being, learning to shed its skin. The confusion you feel is not your confusion alone, but the confusion of existence itself as it experiments with new forms of being, new ways of experiencing itself through the unique lens of your consciousness. The ancient alchemists knew that the work of transformation could not be hurried, could not be controlled or directed by the will of the ego. They understood that the nigredo, this phase of dissolution and darkness, must be allowed to run its course completely before any new synthesis could emerge. To interrupt the process prematurely, to grasp for premature certainty or false comfort, would abort the transformation and leave you stranded in a liminal state, neither what you were nor what you could become. And so you wait, suspended in the golden darkness of your own becoming, learning the patience of the chrysalis, the trust of the dissolving caterpillar. You are learning to be nobody in order to become somebody new, learning to know nothing in order to understand everything, learning to die while still living so that you might be born again into the fullness of your authentic nature. In this sacred confusion, this blessed bewilderment, you are discovering what it means to be truly alive, not as a fixed identity, but as an ever-flowing process of becoming. An eternal dance between form and formlessness, being and non-being, death and rebirth. From the fertile darkness of the soul's winter, something begins to stir. Not the familiar voice of social acceptability that has guided us through countless conversations and careful presentations of self, but something altogether different, true, unpolished, startlingly alive. This is the language of authenticity, and it speaks with the rhythm of truth rather than the measured cadence of convention. At first, this voice emerges as a whisper, uncertain of its right to exist. It has been so long buried beneath layers of learned response, so thoroughly silenced by the demands of acceptability, that it speaks tentatively, like a child who has forgotten how to ask for what it needs. Yet even in its hesitancy, there is something unmistakably real about its equality of presence that cuts through the elaborate performances we have constructed around our lives. This authentic voice does not speak in the polished phrases of our personas. It does not know how to package difficult truths in comfortable wrapping, how to soften its edges for easier consumption by others. Instead, it speaks with the startling directness of deep water, carrying currents of feeling that have been dammed up for decades, expressing needs that were long ago deemed inappropriate, unsuitable, too much or not enough for the careful choreography of social existence. To hear this voice, really hear it, requires a fundamental shift in our relationship to ourselves. We must learn to listen, not with the critical ear of the ego, always editing and refining for external approval, but with the open receptivity of the soul, which recognizes truth not by its palatability, but by its resonance with our deepest nature. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the journey toward authenticity, developing trust in our own inner authority, when everything in our conditioning has taught us to seek validation elsewhere. The language of authenticity carries different rhythms than the speech we have mastered for public consumption. where our social voice tends toward performance modulated, controlled, calibrated for effect. This deeper voice flows with the irregular pulse of lived experience. It pauses where the heart needs to gather courage, rushes forward when passion demands expression, falls silent when the magnitude of feeling exceeds the capacity of words. It is not eloquent in the conventional sense, but it possesses something far more valuable than eloquence. It possesses truth. Jung understood that the authentic self emerges not through perfection but through what he called the transcendent function, capacity to hold paradox, to integrate opposites, to embrace both our light and our shadow with equal compassion. The language of authenticity reflects this integration. It speaks of our failures as readily as our successes, acknowledges our confusion alongside our clarity, admits our needs without shame or apology. It is a voice that has learned to be imperfectly real rather than perfectly false. This emergence of authentic expression often disturbs those around us who have grown comfortable with our familiar masks. The voice that once said yes to every request now discovers its capacity for no. The person who always smoothed over conflict now finds themselves willing to name uncomfortable truths. The one who apologized for taking up space begins to claim their rightful place in the world with unapologetic presence. These changes can feel threatening to relationships built on our predictable patterns of self-suppression. Yet this disruption, uncomfortable as it may be, signals something profound: the resurrection of our authentic self from the tomb of social conditioning. Like Lazarus emerging from the grave, still wrapped in burial cloths, we begin to speak with a voice that carries the unmistakable authority of one who has died to their false self and been reborn into truth. The words may come haltingly at first, but they carry the weight of genuine experience rather than the hollow echo of borrowed wisdom. Learning to trust this inner speaker becomes an act of faith, not religious faith, but the deeper faith of the soul in its own capacity for truth. We learn to trust the pause that comes before difficult conversations, the hesitation that signals our need to find our real words rather than our convenient ones. We learn to trust the tremor in our voice when we speak what has never been spoken, the tears that come when we finally give voice to long-buried grief, the anger that emerges when we acknowledge how we have betrayed ourselves in service of others. Comfort: the authentic voice does not always say what others want to hear. It cannot, for its primary allegiance is not to harmony but to truth, not to comfort but to reality. It speaks the words that need to be spoken, especially when they threaten the carefully maintained equilibrium of our relationships. This is not cruelty, but compassion of the deepest kind, the willingness to offer the gift of our genuine selves, rather than the hollow comfort of our agreeable facades. As we learn to inhabit this language of authenticity, we discover that it possesses a strange magnetic quality. People begin to respond differently to us, not because we have become more charming or socially skilled, but because we have become more real. There is something in human nature that recognizes and responds to authenticity, even when it makes us uncomfortable. The person who speaks from their genuine experience, who acknowledges their struggles and celebrates their growth without pretense, creates a space where others feel permission to do the same. This is perhaps the greatest gift of learning to speak authentically. We become permission givers for others to find their own genuine voices. Our willingness to be imperfectly real creates a field of possibility where others can risk their own authentic expression. We become living proof that it is possible to survive and even thrive without the protective armor of constant performance. The language of authenticity also teaches us new rhythms of communication. where our conditioned responses tend to be reactive, immediate, designed to maintain our image or control outcomes. Authentic expression often requires patience, the patience to feel our way into what is true rather than what is expedient. We learn to say, "Let me think about that," when asked for an immediate response. We learn to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to provide answers we don't really have. We learn that "I don't know" can be one of the most honest and liberating phrases in our vocabulary. This voice that emerges from our depths carries within it the wisdom of our full experience, not just our successes and strengths, but our failures and vulnerabilities, our confusion and uncertainty, our longings and fears. It speaks from the integrated self, rather than the fragmented personas we have developed for different contexts. It knows no separation between our public and private selves, because it emerges from a place that transcends such artificial divisions. As we continue to practice this language of authenticity, we discover that it has its own intelligence, its own way of knowing what needs to be expressed and when. We begin to trust not just our words, but our silences, not just our assertions, but our questions, not just our certainties, but our wonder. We learn that authentic expression is not about having all the answers, but about being willing to voice our genuine questions, our real struggles, our actual experience of being human. The courage to speak authentically becomes a form of prayer, not a petition to some external deity, but a conversation with the sacred dimension of our own being. Each time we choose truths over convenience, reality over performance, genuine expression over calculated effect, we participate in the ongoing creation of our authentic self. We discover that we are not fixed beings, speaking fixed truths, but dynamic expressions of consciousness, learning to know itself through the vehicle of honest communication. This is the profound gift of finding our authentic voice. It connects us not only to our own depths, but to the depths of others, not only to our individual truth, but to the universal human experience of struggling to be real in a world that often rewards pretense. In learning to speak authentically, we become participants in the great conversation of consciousness awakening to itself. One genuine word at a time, in the great unraveling of the full self, you discover that your relationships too must pass through the fire of transformation. Like a forest floor in autumn, the connections that once seemed so vital begin to shed their vibrant facade, revealing the skeletal truth beneath. Some of these bonds, you realize, with a mixture of grief and relief, were never rooted in the deep soil of authentic being. They were elaborate performances staged for audiences who were themselves performing. A theater of mutual deception, dressed in the costumes of intimacy. Watch how certain friendships begin to feel increasingly hollow. As your persona starts to crack, the conversations that once flowed with practiced ease now feel like reciting lines from a play you no longer believe in. The laughter sounds forced, echoing in the empty spaces where genuine connection should dwell. These relationships, built upon the careful curation of acceptable traits, cannot survive the earthquake of your emerging authenticity. They were architecture designed for a self you are no longer willing to be. This recognition brings its own peculiar sorrow, not just the loss of connection, but the realization that perhaps there never was true connection to lose. You begin to understand that what you mourned as intimacy was often merely the comfort of shared performance, the relief of finding others willing to participate in the same elaborate pretense. You were actors, admiring each other's masks, never daring to glimpse the faces beneath. Yet nature abhors a vacuum, and as these superficial connections wither and fall away like autumn leaves, something profound begins to stir in the newly cleared ground of your relational landscape. Space opens raw, vulnerable space that your persona-bound self would have frantically tried to fill with new performances, new masks, new audience members to validate the ongoing show. But now, in this pregnant emptiness, you discover a capacity you had forgotten you possessed, the ability to be seen, truly seen, in all your contradictory wholeness. The ecology of authentic relationship operates on entirely different principles than the ecosystem of performance. Where the persona seeks validation and approval, the integrated self seeks witnessing and understanding. Where the full self curates and controls what others are allowed to see, the authentic self gradually learns the terrifying art of revelation. It begins to speak from the place where shadow and light intermingle, where vulnerability becomes a bridge rather than a wall. You discover that there are people, perhaps fewer than you once thought, but infinitely more precious, who can hold space for your complexity. These are the souls who do not flinch when your carefully constructed facade begins to crack, who remain present when you reveal the aspects of yourself that your persona works so tirelessly to hide. They love not your presentation, but your essence, not your performance, but your truth. This differentiation between audience and communion becomes one of the most crucial discernments of your transformative journey. An audience requires entertainment, consistency, and the comfort of the familiar. They come to watch the show, to be pleased or disappointed by your performance, to judge whether you have met their expectations of who they believe you should be. Communion, however, asks for something entirely different, calls forth presence, authenticity, and the willingness to be met in the mysterious space, where two souls recognize each other beyond the boundaries of personality. Learning to recognize the difference is like developing a new sensory organ, one attuned to the subtle frequencies of genuine connection. You begin to sense when someone is relating to your persona versus when they are touching something deeper, more essential. You feel the difference in your body, the slight tension that arises when you realize you are being loved for your performance, the profound relaxation that occurs when you sense you are being seen for who you truly are. The relationships that survive this great winnowing often undergo their own metamorphosis. Connections that seemed casual or peripheral may suddenly reveal unexpected depths, while bonds you thought were unshakable may prove to have been built on the shifting sands of mutual projection. Friends who knew only your social self may feel threatened by your emerging authenticity, while acquaintances who glimpsed your shadow may step forward to offer unexpected support. There is something both humbling and liberating about discovering that love itself has layers, dimensions you had never explored. The love that requires you to maintain a certain image, to perpetually earn approval through good behavior, to hide your struggles and imperfections. This love, however well-intentioned, becomes a prison for the soul. But the love that can hold your full humanity, that remains steady through your seasons of darkness as well as light, that celebrates your complexity rather than demanding your simplification. This love becomes the very medium through which transformation occurs. In these authentic connections, you learn that conflict itself takes on a different quality. Rather than threats to be avoided or performances to be managed, disagreements become opportunities for deeper understanding. When two people are committed to seeing and being seen truly, even that friction becomes a form of intimacy, a way of polishing each other's rough edges, without demanding conformity to some idealized image. You begin to understand that healthy relationships, like healthy ecosystems, require both connection and boundaries, both intimacy and individuation. The codependent merging that your persona once mistook for love gives way to a more mature form of connection, one that can hold both union and separation, both togetherness and solitude. You learn to love others not for how they complete you, but for who they are in their own wholeness. This new ecology of relationship extends beyond the human realm. Your connection to nature, to work, to creative expression, to the sacred all begin to shift as your persona dissolves. You find yourself drawn to activities, places, and practices that nourish your authentic self, rather than feeding your image. The hobbies you pursued for status lose their appeal, while forgotten passions may suddenly reawaken with surprising intensity. Even your relationship with solitude transforms. Where once you may have filled every quiet moment with distraction or social engagement, you now discover the profound intimacy possible with your own being. Solitude becomes not loneliness, but communion with the self, a chance to tend the inner garden without the need to perform for any audience. In this great ecological shift, you realize that the quality of your relationships reflects the quality of your relationship with yourself. As you learn to hold space for your own contradictions, you become capable of holding space for others. As you practice compassion for your own imperfections, you develop the capacity to love others, not despite their flaws, but including them. The ecology of authentic relationship is ultimately an ecology of the sacred, where each connection becomes a mirror reflecting back not just your persona but your soul. In learning to differentiate between audience and communion, you discover that love itself is the great integrator, the force that allows both shadow and light to coexist in the sacred space between hearts that dare to know and be known truly. In the depths of the psyche, where the persona's careful censorship has held dominion for so long, something stirs, like the first movement of underground water seeking the surface. These are the emotions, raw, unfiltered, authentic, that have been waiting in the dark chambers of the unconscious, patient as prisoners who have never forgotten the taste of freedom. As the golden mask begins to crack and crumble, these long-suppressed feelings rise like underground rivers breaking through to sunlight, carrying with them the mineral richness of lived experience that no social acceptability could ever match. The alchemists of old spoke of the transformation of base metal into gold. But they understood something that the literal mind misses. This was never about material transmutation, but about the sacred work of psychological transformation. In the laboratory of the soul, the lead of suppressed emotion becomes the gold of conscious feeling, not through denial or refinement, but through the courageous act of allowing what has been forbidden to finally flow. Consider the anger that has been banished to the shadowlands of the unacceptable, that fierce, protective energy that the persona learned to swallow, to smile over, to transform into the bitter alchemy of resentment. For years, perhaps decades, this anger has fermented in the darkness, growing more concentrated, more potent, more dangerous in its suppression. But when the hermit's path has taught us to trust our inner landscape, when the crumbling persona no longer guards the gates of emotional expression so vigilantly, this anger finally finds its voice. And what a voice! It is not the petulant whining of the ego or the destructive rage of the unconscious, but the clear, clean fire of authentic boundary setting, the sacred no that protects what is precious, the righteous fury that says this far and no further, to those who would diminish or exploit or dismiss the tender truth of our being. This anger, when consciously felt and expressed, becomes not destruction but creation, the force that carves out space for authentic selfhood in a world that prefers the malleable compliance of the persona. But anger is only one current in this underground river of feeling. There is grief, too, the profound sorrow for all the years lost to performance, for the authentic self that was exiled so young, for the countless moments when we chose safety over truth, acceptance over authenticity. This grief carries the weight of what Jung called the unlived life, all the possibilities that were sacrificed on the altar of social acceptability, all the words that were never spoken, all the dreams that were abandoned in favor of more realistic pursuits. When this grief finally surfaces, it comes not as the neat, contained sadness that the persona learned to display when appropriate, but as the vast oceanic sorrow that connects us to the universal human experience of loss. To feel this grief fully is to understand that we mourn, not just our own unlived life, but the collective tragedy of a species that has forgotten how to honor its own depths. This grief, paradoxically, becomes a doorway to compassion for ourselves, for others, for the impossible complexity of being human in a world that demands simplicity. And then there is joy, not the manufactured happiness that the persona learned to produce on demand, but the wild, inexplicable delight that arises when the authentic self finally tastes freedom. This joy has no reason, no justification, no appropriate time or place. It bubbles up from the deep wells of being like spring water after a long drought, carrying with it the effervescence of life itself, unfiltered and uncontained. This authentic joy is dangerous to the social order because it cannot be commodified or controlled. It does not depend on external circumstances or achievements or approval. It exists as a direct expression of the soul's recognition of its own nature, and in that recognition, it threatens every system that depends on our discontent, our striving, our endless hunger for what we do not have. The persona learned to be suspicious of such joy, to question its appropriateness, to moderate its expression. But in the alchemy of emotional truth, this joy becomes pure gold, the treasure that no external circumstance can steal. Terra, too, has its place in this emotional symphony, not the manufactured fears that keep us compliant and small, but the authentic terror of standing naked before the mystery of existence, of recognizing how little we actually control, of facing the vast unknown that surrounds the small island of our conscious awareness. This terror is not pathology but wisdom, the appropriate response of a finite being encountering the infinite, of a mortal creature touching the edges of eternity. When we learn to feel this terror without immediately rushing to escape it, it becomes a gateway to awe, to reverence, to the kind of humility that opens us to forces larger than our ego's small concerns. The persona taught us to fear this terror, to medicate it, to deny it, to construct elaborate illusions of control and certainty. But the alchemy of emotional truth reveals that this terror is actually a form of sacred sensitivity, the soul's recognition of its own vastness and vulnerability, the transformation that occurs when we allow the full spectrum of human feeling to move through us is nothing short of miraculous. Like weather systems moving across an open sky, emotions arise, intensify, and pass away, leaving the atmosphere clear and fresh in their wake. But this can only happen when we stop trying to control the weather, stop trying to maintain perpetual sunshine, stop fearing the storms that naturally arise in any living system. The persona's emotional repertoire was like a thermostat set to pleasant, maintaining a narrow range of acceptable feeling that never challenged anyone, including ourselves. But authentic emotional life is more like a musical instrument capable of playing the full range of human experience, from the lowest bass notes of grief to the highest frequencies of ecstatic joy, with all the complex harmonies and dissonances in between. This emotional alchemy requires what the alchemists called the solve et coagula, dissolving and coagulating, breaking down and building up. The old emotional patterns of the persona must be dissolved, the automatic smile, the suppressed anger, the performed enthusiasm. In that place, new patterns emerge, responses that arise from the authentic core, rather than the adapted surface. Expressions that carry the unique signature of our individual being, rather than the generic stamp of social acceptability. The gold that emerges from this process is not perfection, but presence, the capacity to be fully here with whatever arises, to meet life with the totality of our being, rather than the carefully edited version that the persona offered. This presence becomes a gift, not only to ourselves, but to everyone we encounter, for authentic feeling is contagious in the best possible way. When we dare to feel fully, we give others permission to do the same. When we refuse to hide behind emotional masks, we create space for real intimacy, real connection, real love. In the end, the alchemy of emotional truths reveals that what we feared would destroy us, the full force of human feelings, actually what makes us most fully alive, most genuinely human, most capable of the depth and authenticity that the soul has been seeking all along. There comes a moment when the soul declares its independence, not with the loud proclamations of adolescent defiance, but with the quiet certainty of one who has touched something eternal and refuses to betray it for the approval of a world that has forgotten its own sacred nature. This is the sacred rebellion, the holy revolution that Jung recognized as essential to the process of individuation, where the individual finally chooses to serve the self with capital S, rather than the countless small gods of social expectation that have held them captive for so long. This rebellion does not announce itself with flags and manifestos. It whispers its arrival in the simple act of saying no when every fiber of your conditioning screams yes. It reveals itself in the moment. You choose to speak your truths even though your words will disappoint those who prefer the comfortable lie of your former compliance. It emerges in the quiet decision to honor what moves you deeply, regardless of whether it fits the narrow categories of what others consider appropriate, profitable, or proper. You begin to recognize the difference now between the ego's petty rebellions, those reactive outbursts against authority that seek only to assert dominance or express frustration, and the sacred rebellion of the soul that emerges from a deeper allegiance to truth itself. The ego rebels against what it dislikes. The self rebels against what violates the fundamental integrity of your being. The ego seeks to overturn external power structures. The self seeks to align with the organizing principle of the cosmos that moves through you like a river through its chosen channel. This distinction becomes crucial as you navigate the treacherous waters of authentic transformation. For there are many false rebellions that masquerade as spiritual evolution, the rejection of all structure, simply because it is structure, the dismissal of all tradition, simply because it comes from the past, the embrace of chaos, merely because it opposes order. These are not the movements of the awakening self, but the tantrums of an ego that has not yet learned to distinguish between healthy boundaries and oppressive limitations. The sacred rebellion, by contrast, emerges from a deep listening to what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to synthesize opposing forces into a new wholeness. You find yourself capable of honoring tradition while transcending its limitations, of respecting authority while refusing to surrender your own inner knowing, of maintaining loving relationships while insisting on the space to become who you truly are. This is rebellion as reverence, Defiance as devotion to a higher law that operates not through external commandments, but through the subtle guidance of your own deepest nature. You begin to understand that what appears as disobedience to the world may actually be the most profound obedience to the evolutionary impulse that seeks to manifest itself through your unique configuration of consciousness. The external world, of course, does not immediately recognize the sacred nature of your rebellion. Family members wonder why you no longer laugh at jokes that demean others, why you no longer participate in conversations that feed on gossip and judgment. Colleagues question your sudden unwillingness to compromise your values for career advancement, your strange insistence on bringing meaning and purpose into discussions that were previously purely transactional. Friends feel confused by your growing need for solitude, your decreasing interest in activities that once brought you pleasure but now feel hollow and mechanical. You are learning to trust an authority that cannot be seen or measured by conventional standards, the authority of your own awakening consciousness, the wisdom that emerges from the marriage of your personal experience with the universal. Patterns that Jung recognized as the collective unconscious. This is not the authority of arrogance or superiority, but the humble recognition that you have been entrusted with a particular piece of the cosmic puzzle, a unique perspective that contributes to the greater wholeness of existence. The sacred rebellion teaches you to distinguish between the voices that seek to diminish you and those that seek to guide you toward your fullest expression. You learn to recognize the difference between criticism that serves growth and criticism that serves control, between love that supports your becoming and love that demands your compliance. You develop what Jung called a discriminating consciousness, the ability to discern what serves your authentic development and what merely serves the preservation of systems that fear change. This discernment is not easy, for it requires you to trust your own inner knowing, even when it contradicts the wisdom of those you have always respected and admired. It asks you to value your own direct experience over the second-hand knowledge that has been transmitted to you through cultural conditioning. It demands that you become the ultimate authority on your own life, while remaining humble enough to recognize that this authority is not the small self's willful insistence, but the larger self's patient unfolding. You discover that the sacred rebellion is not about destroying what came before, but about transforming it through the alchemy of conscious awareness. The roles you once played, unconsciously parent, partner, professional, begin to be infused with new meaning as you bring your awakened consciousness to bear upon them. You are still a parent, but now you parent from the fullness of your being, rather than from the script you inherited. You are still a partner, but now you love from your authentic nature, rather than from your fear of abandonment. You are still a professional, but now your work becomes an expression of your deepest values, rather than merely a means of survival. This transformation is not without its challenges. The sacred rebel must navigate the delicate balance between honoring their inner truth and maintaining their relationships with those who knew them before their awakening. You learn the art of gentle firmness, of speaking your truth without attacking those who cannot yet hear it, of maintaining your boundaries without building walls that separate you from the love that surrounds you. The rebellion becomes sacred precisely because it serves something greater than your personal preferences or desires. It serves the evolution of consciousness itself, the cosmic process by which awareness becomes increasingly aware of itself through the unique lens of individual experience. You are not rebelling against the world, but rebelling on behalf of a world that has forgotten its own divine nature, demonstrating through your own transformation that another way of being is possible. In the depths of your sacred rebellion, you Discover that you are not destroying but revealing, stripping away the layers of false identity that have obscured the luminous being you have always been. You are not creating a new self, but uncovering the self that has been waiting patiently beneath the accumulations of a lifetime's worth of adaptations and compromises. This is the paradox that Jung understood so deeply, that the most radical act of rebellion is also the most complete act of surrender to the organizing principle of your own being, to the evolutionary impulse that moves through all of existence, to the love that created you and continues to create you in each moment of conscious choice. The sacred rebellion, then, is not an act of defiance, but an act of devotion to the truth of who you are. Devotion to the possibility of a world transformed by individuals who have learned to live from their authentic nature. Devotion to the sacred responsibility of becoming fully human in a world that has forgotten what that means. There comes a moment in the soul's awakening when the rigid choreography of learned behavior begins to dissolve, giving way to something far more fluid, far more alive. Like a dancer who has finally abandoned the memorized steps to move with the music itself. We discover that authentic existence is not a performance to be perfected, but an improvisation to be lived. Moment by precious moment. This is the art of conscious living, the delicate practice of crafting a life from the raw materials of presence, rather than the prefabricated patterns of social expectation. Free from the persona's demanding script, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of genuine creativity, where each choice becomes a brushstroke on the canvas of becoming. Each response and note in the symphony of our unfolding. The shift from unconscious reaction to conscious creation is subtle yet profound. Where once we moved through our days, guided by the autopilot of conditioning, responding predictably to familiar triggers, following the well-worn paths of habit and expectation, we now discover the extraordinary possibility of choice. Not the false choice between predetermined options, but the deeper choice of how to be in each moment. How to meet life with the full spectrum of our authentic nature. Like an artist who has spent years mastering technique only to discover that true artistry lies not in perfect execution, but in the courage to create something genuinely new. We begin to approach our daily existence with fresh eyes. The morning routine becomes an opportunity for mindful presence rather than mindless momentum. The challenging conversation transforms from a problem to be solved into a canvas for authentic expression. The unexpected disruption shifts from an annoyance to be managed into raw material for creative response. This conscious way of living requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold multiple possibilities in awareness, simultaneously to remain present to both our inner landscape and outer circumstances, to respond from wholeness rather than from fragments of conditioning. It is the art of living from the center rather than from the circumference, of drawing our responses from the wellspring of authentic self rather than from the shallow reservoir of learned reactions. In this state of conscious presence, we discover that life itself becomes our medium of expression. Just as a sculptor sees the finished form hidden within the raw marble, we begin to perceive the possibilities for authentic living embedded within each moment's circumstances. The difficult relationship becomes an opportunity to practice genuine communication. The career challenge transforms into a chance to align our work with our deeper values. The unexpected loss reveals itself as an invitation to discover resources we never knew we possessed. The intelligence that guides this conscious living is not the calculating intelligence of the ego, always strategizing for advantage and protection, but what we might call the intelligence of the present moment, that subtle knowing that merges when we align ourselves with the flow of life, rather than struggling against it. This intelligence speaks not in the language of shoulds and musts, but in the whispered guidance of intuition, the quiet knowing of the heart, the somatic wisdom of the body that knows what serves life and what diminishes it. Living consciously means learning to trust this deeper intelligence, even when it leads us away from conventional wisdom or social approval. It means honoring the impulse to pause when everyone else is rushing, to speak when silence would be safer, to change direction when momentum suggests continuing on the familiar path. It is the courage to live from our authentic center rather than from the expectations that surround us. This way of being transforms our relationship to time itself. No longer are we rushing towards some future moment when life will finally begin, when we will finally be worthy, when circumstances will finally align with our desires. Instead, we discover that life is always beginning, always unfolding, always offering itself to us in the eternal now of present moment awareness. Each breath becomes a small birth, each choice a small death of what was in service of what is becoming. The art of conscious living also transforms our relationship to difficulty and challenge. Where once we might have seen obstacles as evidence of life's hostility or our own inadequacy, we begin to recognize them as the very substance from which consciousness crafts wisdom. The difficult emotion becomes a teacher rather than an enemy. The challenging person reveals themselves as a mirror reflecting our own unintegrated aspects. The painful experience transforms into sacred ground where deeper understanding can take root. This shift in perspective is not mere optimism or positive thinking those shallow strategies of the ego to maintain its illusions of control. Rather, it is the profound recognition that consciousness itself is inherently creative, that awareness has the capacity to transform whatever it touches through the simple act of witnessing with presence and compassion. We learn that we are not victims of our circumstances, but creative participants in the ongoing mystery of existence. Living consciously means embracing what the Taoists called wu action that arises from non-action, effort that emerges from effortlessness, doing that flows from being. It is the paradoxical discovery that when we stop trying so hard to control life, life begins to flow through us with unprecedented grace and power. We become instruments through which the deeper intelligence of existence can express itself, channels for the creative force that moves through all of life. This way of being requires immense trust, not the naive trust that everything will turn out as we wish, but the mature trust that whatever emerges from our authentic engagement with life will serve our deepest growth and the growth of all beings. It is the trust of the gardener who plants seeds without guarantees, who tends the soil knowing that the mysterious intelligence of life will do what it does best: create, transform, evolve, become. As we practice this art of conscious living, we discover that our very presence becomes a gift to the world. No longer are we unconsciously projecting our unintegrated shadows onto others. No longer are we depleting ourselves and those around us through the exhausting performance of false selves. Instead, we become sources of authentic presence, spaces where others can encounter their own possibility for genuine existence. The ripple effects of conscious living extend far beyond our individual experience. When we live from authenticity rather than pretense, we give others permission to do the same. When we respond to challenges with creative consciousness rather than reactive patterns, we demonstrate new possibilities for being human. When we treat each moment as sacred rather than mundane, We participate in the ongoing awakening of collective consciousness. This is perhaps the deepest recognition of conscious living, that we are not separate beings struggling to survive in a hostile universe, but expressions of a unified consciousness, exploring itself through the infinite diversity of individual experience. Our willingness to live consciously, to craft our days from presence rather than habit, to respond to life with creative authenticity rather than unconscious reaction, becomes our contribution to the great work of consciousness awakening to itself on. This recognition, every ordinary moment reveals its extraordinary nature. The simple act of preparing a meal becomes a meditation on nourishment and gratitude. The brief encounter with a stranger transforms into an opportunity for genuine human connection. The quiet evening at home reveals itself as a precious space for communion with the deeper rhythms of existence. Living consciously, we discover that we have always been artists, and life has always been our canvas. Now, finally awake to our true nature as creative beings, we begin to paint with the full palette of human experience, creating a masterpiece that is uniquely our own, while serving the greater beauty of the whole in the sacred geometry of transformation. There comes a moment when the ashes speak a language more profound than any living thing has ever dared to utter. You have descended into the flames, felt your carefully constructed self immolated by the fire of truth, witnessed the dissolution of everything you once believed yourself to be. Yet here, in this place beyond death and before birth, something stirs that has never existed before. Not a resurrection of what was, but a birth of what has always been waiting to become. The phoenix that emerges from these ashes carries wisdom in its very bones, a knowing that could only be earned through the complete surrender of the false and the conscious embrace of the whole. This is not the naive innocence of the child who has never been wounded, nor the brittle perfection of the persona that shields itself from life's contradictions. This is conscious wholeness, the integration of every fragment of your being into a unified field of authentic presence. Look at how you move through the world now, and marvel at the paradox you have become. You carry both light and shadow, not as opposing forces locked in eternal combat, but as dance partners moving in perfect synchronicity. Your persona still exists, but it no longer imprisons you. It has become a tool of conscious expression rather than unconscious defense. You can wear the mask when the situation calls for it, but you are no longer trapped behind it, forgotten and suffocating in its airless chambers. This is the phoenix's first teaching, that death and birth are not sequential events, but simultaneous revelations. In burning away what was false, you did not destroy yourself, you revealed yourself. The flames that seemed so terrifying from the outside were actually the very medium through which your true nature could finally express itself without compromise or apology. Your wings now span dimensions that your former self could never have imagined. On one wing, you carry the accumulated wisdom of your shadow work, the dark gold mined from the depths of your rejected aspects, the fierce power reclaimed from what you once deemed unacceptable. This wing knows the territory of rage and desire, of wildness and instinct, of the untamed forces that conventional society taught you to fear and suppress. It has learned that these energies, when consciously integrated, become sources of vitality and authenticity rather than destruction. On the other wing, you bear the refined essence of your highest aspirations, not the inflated fantasies of the ego, but the genuine expressions of your soul's deepest purpose. This wing has learned to soar not by denying the earth, but by honoring both ground and sky, understanding that true transcendence includes, rather than excludes, the full spectrum of human experience. The phoenix's wisdom whispers that individuation is not a destination but a dynamic process, not a state to be achieved but a way of being to be continually embodied. You have learned to dance with the eternal tension between becoming and being, between growth and acceptance, between the call to transform and the need to rest in what is. In your relationships now, people encounter not a performance, but a presence. They meet someone who can hold space for complexity their own and others, without needing to fix, change, or improve anyone. Your love has been purified in the flames of self-discovery, freed from the contamination of projection and need. You can see others clearly now because you have learned to see yourself without the distorting lens of fear or the beautifying filter of denial. The work you do in the world carries a different quality now, whether you are teaching or healing, creating or building, parenting or partnering. Your actions arise from the integrated center of your being, rather than from the fragmented demands of an unexamined psyche. There is a coherence to your life that was impossible when different aspects of yourself were at war with each other. When your conscious mind pursued goals that your unconscious sabotaged, when your persona promised what your shadow refused. To deliver. This coherence is not perfection. The phoenix knows that perfection is the enemy of wholeness. Instead, it is the dynamic harmony that emerges when all parts of the self have been acknowledged, honored, and brought into conscious relationship with each other. Your flaws have not disappeared. They have been transformed from sources of shame into teachers of humility, from hidden enemies into known allies. The phoenix carries in its heart the understanding that the spiritual journey is not about transcending humanity, but about fully embodying it. The highest enlightenment you can achieve is not the escape from your human nature, but the complete acceptance and integration of it. You have learned that your wounds were not obstacles to your awakening, but its very doorways. That your mistakes were not detours from your path, but its essential curriculum. In moments of quiet reflection, you can feel the presence of all your former selves, the innocent child, the rebellious adolescent, the striving young adults, the disillusioned seeker. They have not been left behind or transcended. They have been gathered into the council of your wholeness, each contributing their unique wisdom to the symphony of your integrated being. The phoenix honors every stage of the journey, recognizing that each apparent death was actually a birth. In disguise, your relationship with suffering has been completely transformed. Where once you fled from pain or became identified with it, you now understand suffering as one of the great teachers on the path of individuation. You have learned to meet your pain with presence rather than resistance, to listen to its messages, without becoming lost in its drama. This does not mean you seek suffering or romanticize it, but that you no longer fear it as the enemy of your peace. The phoenix knows that true wisdom cannot be taught, can only be lived. Integrated, embodied, through the alchemy of experience. You have become a living testament to the possibility of transformation, not through your words, but through your being. Your very presence in the world becomes an invitation for others to undertake their own journey of individuation, to risk their own encounter with the flames of authentic becoming. Standing now in the fullness of your integrated nature, you understand that the death of the mask was never destruction, but metamorphosis, never loss, but liberation into your truest nature. The phoenix that you have become carries wings strong enough to soar above the storms of life, while remaining grounded in the earth of human experience. You have learned to fly, not by escaping your humanity, but by embracing it so completely that it becomes translucent to the divine light that has always been your deepest essence. This is the phoenix's ultimate wisdom. that you were never broken and in need of fixing, never incomplete and requiring addition, never fallen and needing redemption. You were always whole, always perfect in your imperfection, always divine in your humanity. The journey was never about becoming someone else, but about remembering who you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning and fear. The flames simply burned away what was never truly you, revealing the eternal fire that is your birthright, your essence, your truest and most sacred self. The journey that began with the recognition of our golden prison now completes itself in a return. That is also a beginning, a re-emergence into the world that carries within it all the treasure of the depths. But this is not the return of the defeated exile or the triumphant conqueror. This is the return of the transformed, the one who has died to the old way of being and been reborn into something unprecedented, a human being who has learned to live from the inside out rather than the outside in. The world we return to appears unchanged, yet everything has shifted because the eyes that behold it have been fundamentally altered. The same social situations, the same relationships, the same daily encounters, but now experienced through the consciousness of one who has learned the difference between performing and being, between adaptation and authenticity, between the mask and the face that wears it. Most remarkably, the persona itself has undergone a profound transformation. Where once it was unconscious compulsion and automatic response system that operated without our conscious participation, it now becomes conscious choice. Like an actor who has mastered their craft so completely that they can step in and out of character at will. We learn to engage the persona when it serves us and set it aside when it does not. This is the crucial distinction that Jung recognized between being possessed by the persona and possessing it as a tool. In certain social situations, we recognize that some degree of adaptation is not only appropriate, but skillful, a form of courtesy that honors both our own needs and the needs of others. The business meeting may call for professional demeanor, the family gathering for diplomatic restraint, the casual encounter for light-hearted engagement. But now these are conscious choices made from a place of inner stability rather than desperate attempts to secure approval or avoid rejection. The difference is palpable. When the persona is consciously worn, it carries a quality of presence that was never there before. Sense of someone real, choosing to engage in a particular way, rather than someone performing their only known script. Others can feel this difference even when they cannot name it. There is a substance to such interactions, a weight of authentic presence that makes even the most conventional social exchanges feel more meaningful. We become bridges between worlds who can speak both the language of the depths and the language of the surface. Interpreters who can help others recognize the authentic impulses that lie beneath their own social performances. This is not done through preaching or teaching in the conventional sense, but through the simple presence of someone who has learned to be real in a world of pretense. The capacity to move fluidly between solitude and society becomes one of our greatest gifts. We no longer need to choose between the hermit's path and engagement with the world, for we have learned that these are not opposites, but complementary rhythms in the dance of authentic living. The solitude we return to is different now, not the desperate retreat of the overwhelmed persona, but the conscious renewal of the one who understands that inner work is the foundation of outer service. In this dance between withdrawal and engagement, we discover that each movement informs and enriches the other. The insights gained in solitude become gifts we bring to our relationships. The challenges encountered in social interaction become material for deeper self-understanding. We learn to honor both the voice that calls us inward and the voice that calls us outward. Recognizing that wholeness includes both the depth of introspection and the breadth of connection. The treasure we carry, this hard-won, authentic, to be not a possession, to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared. Simply by being ourselves, we give others permission to be themselves. Our refusal to hide behind masks creates space for others to remove their own. Our willingness to speak authentically invites authentic response. Our capacity to hold both light and shadow in ourselves makes us safer companions for others on their own journeys toward wholeness. This transformation ripples outward in ways we may never fully recognize. The colleague who finds courage to speak their truth in a meeting, the friend who finally admits their struggles, the family member who stops pretending everything is fine. These moments of authentic breakthrough often trace back to the simple presence of someone who has learned to be real. We become like tuning forks, resonating at the frequency of authenticity and awakening similar vibrations in others. The relationship to vulnerability undergoes a particularly profound shift. Where the persona feared exposure as the ultimate threat, the authentic self recognizes vulnerability as the birthplace of intimacy, creativity, and genuine strength. We learn to share our struggles, not as failures to be ashamed of, but as human experiences that connect us to the universal challenges of existence. This does not mean becoming inappropriately appealing, but rather developing the wisdom to know when and how and with whom our vulnerabilities can be shared in service of deeper connection. The old patterns of seeking validation and avoiding rejection do not disappear entirely, but they lose their compulsive quality. We can feel these ancient impulses arising without being possessed by them. Like weather patterns moving through an open sky, they are noticed, acknowledged, and allowed to pass without defining our actions. This is what Jung called the development of the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can witness our own psychological processes without being overwhelmed by them. In our professional lives, we bring a quality of presence that was absent during our persona-dominated years. The work itself may not change dramatically, but the way we engage with it transforms completely. Decisions are made from inner clarity rather than external pressure. Relationships with colleagues develop depth and authenticity. The chronic exhaustion that comes from constant performance gives way to the sustainable energy that flows from aligned action. Our intimate relationships undergo perhaps the most profound transformation. No longer do we seek partners who will validate our persona or collude in our pretenses. Instead, we are drawn to those who can meet us in our authenticity, who can hold space for our full humanity, who are themselves engaged in the work of becoming real. These relationships carry a quality of depth and safety that makes the old surface connections feel like mere rehearsals for this deeper intimacy. The return to the world is ultimately the return of love, not the conditional love that the persona learned to earn through performance, but the unconditional love that flows naturally from the authentic self. This love is not sentimental or weak, but fierce and protective, capable of saying both yes and no with equal clarity. It is love that honors the whole human being, not just the acceptable parts. It is love that recognizes the sacred in the ordinary, the eternal in the temporal, the divine and the human. As we embody this integrated way of being, we fulfill what Jung saw as our deepest purpose, the individuation process that serves not only our own wholeness, but the evolution of consciousness itself. Each person who learns to live authentically adds to the collective wisdom, expanding the possibility for others to do the same. We become part of the solution to humanity's ancient dilemma of how to be both individual and connected. both true to ourselves and caring for others. The treasure we have discovered, this capacity for authentic being, proves to be the more freely we give it, the more abundantly it flows. The more courageously we embody it, the more space we create for others to discover their own authentic nature. We learn that the greatest gift we can offer the world is not our performance of perfection, but our willingness to be beautifully, courageously, authentically human.